Welcome to Leadership Forward, where you'll meet Arizonans with innovative answers to our state's greatest challenges. I'm Dawn Wallace from the Arizona Center for Civic Leadership at the Flinn Foundation. With 22 recognized tribes in Arizona, our state is rich in Indigenous culture and tradition, and I'm so happy to invite our Flinn-Brown Fellow from 2013, Alfred Urbina, to the podcast today. And he's going to help us understand the relationship between state and tribal governments, the importance of cultural preservation, and give us an insight on his leadership style. Welcome to the podcast, Fred.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you for having me today.
Well, I always like to start off with asking our fellows to tell me a little bit about themselves, their journey into their professional life, kind of what got them started, and one of those important milestones to leadership.
Okay, thank you. I'll just start off by mentioning I'm a husband to a beautiful wife named Shannon. I'm a grandfather. I have 4 daughters and 6 granddaughters and a few grandsons. And I guess part of my origin story starts quite a while ago in South Tucson. I grew up in Tucson. I'm a member of the busboy tribe, and getting to where I'm at today started as a young boy, I guess you can say. I started working as a youth, throwing the newspaper.
Yeah, I read your first job was with the Arizona Daily Star. Is
yes,
that it? You were a paperboy?
I was a paperboy. And I worked through school, then decided to join the Army. And I was in the Army for about 5 years. Came back to Tucson with my family and started working in the restaurant industry. And then eventually started using my GI Bill to go to college and focusing on criminal justice. So I was able to get an associate degree in criminal justice, a bachelor's degree also in the administration of criminal justice. And through that time, I started working as a police officer for the state of Arizona. And that lasted for about 7 years until one of my professors told me that I should probably consider law school. As a young person coming from the south side of Tucson, I went to Pueblo High School. I didn't know that was in reach, if you will. And so I started to explore that and eventually applied to law school. I should mention that, in being accepted to law school, doing well enough to pass through law school and also getting passing the Arizona bar exam. I had a lot of people, rooting for me. Specifically, my mom prayed for me during that time. A lot of prayers, I think, helped me get to where I'm at today. And, when someone prays for you like that, it sets up what we call a manda, essentially. Someone's praying for me. I'm asking for something, or they're asking for something for me to happen. And in return, I have to do something. And that includes anything from pilgrimage, which I ended up doing from Nogales to Magdalena. Or it could be a service, a ceremonial service for a number of years, which I've also done for my tribe, for prayers that have happened from my family. And I believe that was a good reason, one of the reasons why I was able to progress and be where I'm at today, specifically going to law school and then passing the Arizona bar and being able to serve the busboy tribe, my people, for a number of years.
The promise you made, the promise of being given an opportunity to serve in your community through this opportunity of going to law school. Do you see? You said at the beginning that it was out of reach. Why was it out of reach for you?
I think growing up in South Tucson, I never met an attorney before. I didn't. Nobody in my family had ever gone to law school. It's something that I think I've thought about, and I just never knew how attainable that could be. And so it was always on the back of my mind. I was working in law enforcement. I had been in the military, and I felt like that might have been the trajectory. Maybe I end up retiring as a law enforcement officer or working for my tribe in that capacity. And so I was able to have a few professors that were attorneys and mentioned that I should eventually apply.
So as you were considering this career in criminal justice, you started as a military police officer. You got your law degree. And then what was your first position as a newly minted attorney?
I was a prosecutor for the Pasquayaqui tribe. And I did that for a number of years, working as a prosecutor for my reservation for the Pasquayaqui tribe.
Can you share a little bit about some of the issues that you saw through the lens of a prosecutor, challenges that are unique to tribes, and then their interrelatability or to the state government? Were there issues when tribal members were engaged in some sort of adjudication with outside of tribal government?
Sure. I think there's like several layers in that question, but also several layers of complexities that I started out in. Essentially, the tribal courts have limited jurisdiction, and it was even more limited at the time. And so each jurisdiction in Arizona, the state, the federal government, and tribes have jurisdiction over a subset of crimes and or people, depending on your race, depending on the type of crime, depending on whether it's a felony. And then there's different levels of concurrent jurisdiction that also exists. And so if a person is arrested on the reservation and they're a tribal member, generally that case would be handled by the tribe or the federal government, depending on the level of crime committed, felony or misdemeanor. And so that was part of it. There's a housing shortage on reservations, so the majority of tribal members live off reservation. And so there's always a movement back and forth of tribal members from the state of Arizona, Phoenix, Flagstaff, Tucson, back to reservations. And so that creates problems, that creates jurisdictional gaps that exist from people moving back and forth. Your question about whether, when people get arrested on reservation or off reservation is important because it's tied to those movement dynamics, this mobility that happens back and forth. And often state prosecutors will call tribal prosecutors and ask them, hey, look, here's what I have. The victim lives on reservation. The defendant is here in town. How should we handle this? And so there's a lot of communication that has to happen between jurisdictions. So
when you say jurisdictional gaps, do you find that there's a protocol for cooperation, or are those gaps really, gray areas where it's not settled in terms of who has first rights to either prosecute or not to prosecute?
Dawn, I think there's people that will tell you that there's always a forum, no matter what the crime or who the person is, for a crime to be prosecuted or an issue to be addressed, and that is certainly true. Where the breakdown happens is the actual implementation or the actual once we identify who's responsible, sometimes the follow-up doesn't happen, whether it's the federal government through the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI, the tribal government, or even the state government. So there's a lot of cases that are either not being investigated, not being prosecuted, or being declined once a case is investigated. So it starts to, and that's based on a number of reasons, like geography, distance from places, things like resources, the number of law enforcement officers available for calls, to the funding of tribal court systems, the inadequate funding of tribal court systems, and then a lot of the declinations that are happening from the U.S. Attorney's Office. And that's based on sometimes poor investigations or just not enough information to bring a prosecution in federal court.
Well, you've served as a prosecutor, but you've also been a judge. Can you share, so both sides of the coin, can you tell me about your experiences as a tribal judge? How did that happen? Can you tell me a little bit of the story of how you're sort of moved from that role as a prosecutor to then sort of being the judge?
At the time, I was working as an attorney general for the Tohono Nation. And so our tribe needed a judge, an associate judge. They reached out, I applied, and I was able to get the job to sit and serve as a judge for my community. And that experience was also interesting because now, like you mentioned, I'm on the other side of the bench. I'm listening to arguments. My job is to be fair and to listen to both sides. And sometimes people are unrepresented. There's a lack of legal resources on reservations, so the judge has to be very careful about how he handles cases, how he or she handles these cases before them, and understanding that there's limited resources out there, and the cases are going to track sometimes a lot faster than they do in state court, and then the people that are coming to the court are probably going to need a little bit more assistance than even your average pro se person in the state of Arizona, Tucson, or Phoenix. And so it's a lot of education, a lot of communicating with people, and even if you've got some hard deadlines, you have to maybe give a little bit of leeway and explain to people the importance of court procedure. Sometimes there's language issues. Sometimes there's cultural issues that come to play. There's times where there's cultural ceremonies throughout the year that can impact your types of cases, whether it be a reduction in criminal cases to people that need to come out of jail to participate in ceremonies. So there's a lot of other considerations that you might not see in a state court system, but you have to be culturally competent enough to know when and how these adjustments should be made.
In your current role, or in your most recent role as Attorney General for your tribe, how does that go? How does that work for you from going from this side of the bench and then going back over to the other side of the bench in terms of the Attorney General? What is the work of the Attorney General in tribal government?
Your main client is the tribal council. And so like any municipal government in the state of Arizona, or like the Arizona legislative body, my role is to support the elected leadership of the tribe. And so that is everything from tribal council meetings to the work with them on the development of basic things that are going to be presented in a tribal council meeting, legislation that's going to be passed, federal laws that have to be implemented. A good example is what happened during COVID. A lot of the ARPA funding that was coming out to municipalities, counties, and tribes, all of that has to be implemented. If you're going to shut down your government, you have to have a way to do that. If you're going to deliver other types of services, that's got to be developed into a code or passed through an ordinance. And so it's your basic governance that's happening.
So from the viewpoint of all of these positions you've held in the criminal justice system and tribal government, what do you think are some of the unique challenges that tribal members face seeking justice and safety within tribal jurisdictions and outside?
The thing I mentioned, I feel like there's three reasons why we see the level of violence and the issues that we see on reservations. And that's primarily the lack of criminal and civil jurisdiction by tribal government, also the lack of resources for the development of tribal courts and law enforcement agencies. And then there's also like the historical pieces that are part of what's happening socially on reservations today. And that's given us a situation where tribes might not be in the best position to have a fully functional justice system or law enforcement agencies that are fully staffed. The BIA does provide funding, but generally it's about 20 to 25% of the funding needed to operate a justice system with everything that you would need.
Well, you've worked for two different tribes, your own and Tohono O'odham. Are there differences because of the leadership in tribal governments? I mean, obviously culturally, but is there structure? Is the structure of these two different tribal governments?
The 22 governments in Arizona, the tribal governments in Arizona are, they're all different. They all are structured sometimes a little bit of the same, but you also have distinct differences where the tribal council has the authority. Some tribes are set up like the U.S. government, where you have three separate branches of government, and things sometimes move a little faster, some move a little slower. There's some governments that are still relying on the Bureau of Indian Affairs to deliver government services. And so your law enforcement function, your detention function, maybe even your court function are being regulated. And also the federal government is actually the entity on the reservation that's handling those functions, those tribal government functions. And so so if you go to each reservation, you would notice that there might be a different way that things are set up. Some tribes have constitutions, some don't. And some tribes have newly formed constitutions, so they're a little more modern, and some tribes have constitutions that go back to 1934. And so it's all different, and you have to figure out the structure of that government before you start to work with them to address these issues. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the policy work that you've been doing for years. You have worked on issues like violence against the Women's Act and its implications for tribal nations. Most recently, you were serving on a committee formed by Governor Ducey, I think, addressing missing and murdered Indigenous women. Can you share about that work and sort of the outcomes or the reforms that may have arisen through your work in that area and serving Native women and bringing justice for those women who have been oppressed in this way?
Sure. I think it also goes back to my history. I grew up in a violent, abusive household as a young boy. I can remember, hearing dishes crash in the kitchen. I can remember my father beating my mother, and us having to leave our home in the middle of the night to escape some of the violence that me and my siblings saw growing up. I didn't really connect my career path until recently. Law enforcement, the prosecutor, judge, and then the attorney general responsible for helping implement these federal laws like the Violence Against Women Act, the Tribal Law and Order Act, the Sex Offender Registration Notification Act. But I think that is the impetus is as a father of 4 daughters and granddaughters, just knowing that they deserve to be safe. They deserve the same type of rights that I enjoy, and that's being safe when I walk out my front door. Things that I might take for granted, knowing that my daughters or my nieces or family members, they don't enjoy those same freedoms, those same protections. On reservations, tribes did not have authority or jurisdiction over non-Indian offenders. And so that came from a case that, it was 1978. It was a case called, it's the Oliphant decision, a Supreme Court decision that basically says tribes do not have jurisdiction over non-Indian offenders. And so there's a subclass of crimes that occur on reservations by non-Indian offenders. And so through the Violence Against Women Act of 2013, there's a subgroup of crimes that tribes can now prosecute. Domestic violence, dating violence, violations of protection orders that we started to prosecute here in Arizona. We were one of the first tribes to start to prosecute those cases, and the first tribe to prosecute a non-Indian offender of domestic violence against a tribal woman since 1978. And we've been doing that for 10 years now. And so imagine, all 22 tribes having this authority since 2013. And imagine if they each had 20 to 50 cases of non-Indian violent crimes that they were able to prosecute, and just kind of extrapolate the numbers over that 10-year period of, and those are the cases that are not or were not being addressed prior to the exercise of this jurisdiction. And there's only 3 tribes in Arizona that are currently exercising special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction, and that's Pascoyaki, Gila River, and Salt River. What are
the barriers or limitations to that?
Probably number one is complexity, and then costs. You have to ensure that there are a lot of different provisions in place, including law-trained judges. You have to have, there's got to be due process protections built into your code for non-Indian offenders. That means an attorney, and you have to have a law-trained prosecutor as well if you're going to have a public defender. And so the cost for that kind of system, not only for the legal management of a criminal case, but the law enforcement agency that's going to handle these investigations, and then the detention center that's going to house these folks. That is probably the biggest cost, is the detention cost. And then healthcare is also added. So these parts of the cost weren't incorporated into the Violence Against Women Act in 2013. It was passed, but it was an unfunded mandate, meaning that tribes now have the ability to prosecute a subset of crimes. However, Congress isn't going to provide the funding for it. And so tribes have to come up with the funding to put together a system, and then ensure that you have a complex system set up to address all these potential issues, from the health of the offender in custody to full-blown jury trials. And so some tribes, the tribes just aren't there yet.
They lack the infrastructure
And funding.
We talked a little bit before the podcast about the importance of cultural preservation. Our state's history, you said, runs parallel to the history of our indigenous people. Can you talk a little bit about that with me today and share with me your thoughts about why it's important for Arizonans, from our youngest to our elders, to understand the value of incorporating and embedding sort of our cultural history, and also how we can preserve that culture in our civic education and our teachings to young people.
In Arizona, we talk about the 5 C's, right? Copper, cattle, climate. Citrus and copper,
yeah.
Right? And those are the Arizona 5 C's. It's changing now. But I always think about culture and communities being like the 6th and 7th C, and what makes Arizona, Arizona. And I think historically and civically, Arizona kids in school learn about, when Arizona became a state, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Gadsden Purchase, everything that sets up Arizona from 1848 onward. And there's a parallel history that was happening here. And it starts with that, right? It starts with Manifest Destiny, the U.S. moving westward, and in search of gold or homesteading and settling the West. And Arizona becomes a territory, and then at the same time, there's Indian wars that are happening, that are happening because tribes are refusing to move from their homelands to reservation lands, generally lands that are inhospitable. They are being forced at gunpoint, basically, to move from their traditional homelands onto reservations. And that creates a problem where you have wars that lasted for decades. And that's happening. Arizona's growing. These reservations were not areas that were meant to build thriving communities. And so at the same time, Arizona is cutting off water. We're building dams, and we're settling in places like Phoenix, Tempe, Tucson, and Flagstaff. That parallel history that's happening is also was also like stunted during that same period. In addition to the war and the movement of people from their homes to reservations, there started a boarding school program. We're probably maybe a couple miles away from the Phoenix Indian School. And, when we hear in Arizona, we hear Indian School Road, we don't make these connections. But Arizona as a state had the second largest amount of boarding schools in the country. And so it was a U.S. policy to take Native children from their homes to assimilate them into the larger U.S. society. And that happened from, cutting children's hair to not allowing them to speak their language or practice their culture. They were beaten if they did. They were some kids never came home. And so there's a lot of children that were taken to boarding schools that never came back. And the main purpose was to kill the Indian and save the man. That was the policy behind the boarding school era. And that started here. It started in Carlisle, Pennsylvania first, but I think the Phoenix Indian School closed in 1990. But that was part of federal policy, our historical policy in the state of Arizona, where thousands of kids were removed from where they were in the hopes that they would assimilate. And so the reservations weren't meant to create communities. They were places where people could not leave, and they were being forced to assimilate. And so government structures weren't set up. There is no tax base. And so you start to see degradation of culture, of language over the past century. And so it's something that was instituted per U.S. policy, and it's something that's going to take a lot to overcome to basically get us to a point where tribes can recover.
What do you think we should be doing? What are some steps to recovery, whether it's in our educational institutions, our healthcare institutions, our government? How do we help that integration, making sure that people understand that there is, another history beyond what they're being told, and how do we integrate sort of native culture, language into, all the homes in Arizona? We're all Arizonans.
I think a lot of it could be started by the basic recognition of the past, integrating a lot of this history into Arizona history, requiring that it's taught in our schools. I think the state of Montana has it in their constitution that kids in Montana have to learn about indigenous culture and history. You could start there. There could be, anytime you're working on civic engagement or, civic education, that could be a component for sure. Something that's not left out. When you look at timelines, there's huge chapters that are missing from those timelines that aren't really considered. So even when you go into like a tourist store, you get a mug that has the state of Arizona and has maybe Phoenix and it has a couple of the attractions, but the tribes are left off that little Arizona map. And it's so something as basic as that.
Do you think, Fred, it's because people don't really understand the concept of tribal sovereignty and how that works when, an independent nation lives within the boundaries of another independent nation? Is it that those concepts are not sort of intuitive and congruent in people's minds?
I think that's part of it. I think it does start with teaching. Each of the different tribes are independent sovereignty or even independent sovereigns that come from pre-statehood indigenous beings, right? They were here. They operated as people. They governed the land, the people here, the water, the environment. They still are sovereign entities that have to interact with another sovereign, with the state and the U.S. government as a sovereign. And so I think ensuring that people know that and having government to government relationships and leaders that understand those concepts are important. People like former Governor Ducey, certainly Governor Hobbs has developed her tribal platform that highlights the sovereignty of the tribal nations in Arizona. And so that's important for your top leaders to understand that, people that are going through the Flinn-Brown program to understand the relationship between municipalities, tribal governments, the federal government, just like they understand how the Arizona Constitution is implicated when they're making their laws and their municipal codes. It's just adding another element to that, especially if you have tribes in your legislative district, or if you neighbor a tribe and you have issues that are cross-boundary. Crime doesn't respect borders, so we're all like we're all one, essentially. There's unity and there's certainly separation, but there's a lot of overlapping issues that we should be talking about more often.
Yeah, when policymakers are engaged in work that impacts tribes, it's usually around water or gaming or education. So sovereignty and its definition are seen through those sort of policy lenses. But when you start to think about all the other implications of our criminal justice system, our transportation systems, healthcare, there's so much. It's so important to understand sort of the cultural relevance of all of these things in the context of making public policy, which is where I'm going to go next. You're a member of the Flinn-Brown cohort of 2013. It was one of our early years. And civic leadership has been the entirety of your adult life. I mean, everything from police officer to attorney general and everything in between. Tell me what you see as the important tenets of leadership, particularly in civic life.
For me, especially through my experience in Flinn-Brown, it's understanding how your decisions are impacting people, and from a tribal government level. It's helping to run a government and serve people. For me, it's always been about service, and understanding that those decisions are impacting people's daily lives is important. That was highlighted in Flinn-Brown when I got to interact with people that were from Yavapai County, people from Sierra Vista, learning about their challenges and their leadership traits that, I think it translates across jurisdictions. Are you a good servant? Can you work for people? Are you accountable? There's the need for integrity, honesty and truth. Some of these values that you hear about that are important, especially today. I think Flinn-Brown, for me, having the interaction with these state level leaders and people that I've watched run for office and are serving in different capacities, I think that was for me, understanding that it cuts across jurisdictions, and a good leader is a good leader.
A lot is said about this being the most sort of divisive time in human history, whether it's politics or tensions, racial tensions, the sort of gaps between wealth and poverty. You seem to be a person who has sort of led his life through hope and optimism and a desire for better. Do you ever have moments where all of this noise around us sort of stop you in your tracks and make you question whether or not there is hope for us? You have children and grandchildren, and you're thinking about the next generation. Is there ever a moment where you just go, I'm out? Or do you just sort of draw on your own sort of values and beliefs and say, we must keep that promise?
Yeah, I think I'm a glass half full person. I approach things from a solutions based approach, I guess. We can look at the challenges and the difficulties. I don't think that gets us anywhere, though. I think we could file lawsuits and just basically go negative. We can do that all the time, and we can do that more often on social media now. And that's seems like sometimes that's the first thing people turn to. But in my experience in working with people and working across different governments, whether it's the tribe to city or the tribe to the state or even tribe to Congress and the president, nothing good happens unless you're talking to people, you're working with people, and you can put aside your differences and understand where you have these common threads that bind you. Water is a good example today. We're not going to solve our water issue unless we're all working together. And I think we have the model that people are working on, and we have things that are in place like cross-jurisdictional agreements, things that provide solutions to the problems we have. Even though there are several layers that we have to work through, it can be done when you simply pick up a phone and call someone. You mentioned earlier about laws that impact, tribes or reservations, and all you have to do is ask us the simple question: how does this impact tribal people? And tribes could do the same thing. How does this impact my neighbor? And if there is an impact, can we get together and talk about it and figure out a solution that is going to work for everybody?
Do you see that happening more often today than it has in the past, where all levels of government, all communities understand that tribal nations need to have a seat at the table when we're discussing our collective societal challenges? Or do you think we still have a lot of work left to do there?
I see it happening more often today than in the past. And certainly there's different parts of the state that are going to have different challenges. I see something like this water settlement that's happening right now. It's everybody has negotiated. It involves several tribes, several counties, the state of Arizona, the federal government. That is in front of Congress right now. And I'm not sure if it's going to be passed this session or not, or in the lame duck session. But that took decades. Senator McCain worked on that, and a lot of our state leaders worked on that. And initially it was like this, and we couldn't come to the table. And so now, there's circumstances that have forced people to the table, but certainly to see that actually be at the cusp of passage is incredible. And it's gonna address water uncertainty in the state for years to come. And so that is amazing. It is a testament to the current leaders that are in place in the Arizona legislature, the governor's office of tribal relations, the tribes. Everybody is talking, and I have hope that that's going to pass, and that's going to set up things to happen. That's going to benefit Maricopa County, Pima County, the outskirts of the state, east and west. That model, I believe, can be scaled out to address a lot of different areas.
What would the next sort of issue be that you think that the state needs to tackle as a coalition, as a group?
Probably health. Health in the context of the opioid crisis, fentanyl, things that cross jurisdictional boundaries, crime, all these issues that we've tried to address in the past, and I don't think it's been comprehensive enough. I don't think that we're working together to look at things like prevention and treatment, different things to address, chronic pain. There's a lot of different areas that can be looked at that might not be a legislative solution, but it would be tied to funding and a different approach. So we've been using this model, this carceral system model, at the outset because it does make sense, when you initially look at it. Hey, let's jail the drug dealers, and then that's going to reduce the number of overdose deaths, and so it's just really we're delaying. What we really should be doing is looking at these health issues that are underlying these problems.
The trauma, you mean everything from like physical health to mental health to trauma, everything that sort of gets a person to a point where they do something that causes them to become intimately familiar with the criminal justice system. You're saying more on the front end, or less on the front end and more on the back end, in terms of understanding why people get to where they get to.
Yeah, it's a basic public health approach, but at the same time, it's probably cheaper in the long run if you focus on this than the criminal justice system.
What issues disproportionately affect tribal members? I mean, in the healthcare space, is it the substance abuse? Is it mental health? Is it nutrition? I mean, what are the sort of underlying issues that cause these unfortunate consequences?
Those are issues, I think, that are tied to like intergenerational trauma that has developed over the past century, tied to some of the history that we talked about. Certainly some of the rationing that happened in the early days of simply providing flour and commodities that just weren't good for people's health. And so some of that stuff is considered cultural, like fry bread, and it's just not healthy. The diabetes rate on reservations is very high, along with a lot of other disease tied to diet, tied to the lack of food, the lack of fresh water, things that we take for granted here. You turn on the water, it's there. They're still transporting water on Navajo Nation. No running water. There's a lot of things that are tied to the physical issues that are happening with tribal members across Arizona.
So, Fred, what's next for you? What kind of work are you doing in the public square, and which Flinn-Brown Fellows are you working with? Because I know you do a lot of collaborations in that way.
Well, I want to continue to help scale out some of the solutions that we've worked on, helping tribal communities develop and reform their systems, their justice systems, reduce violent crime, things that I know there are solutions for, and there are ways to scale out some of the solutions that we've developed. And so doing that, I think, is something that is still needed across Arizona, across Indian country, helping counties work with tribes, helping municipalities work with tribes, and tribes work with the state and the federal government, so that we can reduce a lot of the violent crime that we're seeing, a lot of the sexual assaults. Those things are just issues that have to be addressed. And to kind of give people a sense of what that looks like, I asked the listener or the viewer to kind of think about their own home and think about think about being taken from your home, you and people in your neighborhood, and being moved to an inhospitable land and, not being allowed to leave there and not having a system to support you or to keep you safe. And then at the same time, having your children removed and sometimes not being brought back. And knowing that this is still the state of many places across Arizona Indian country. These are, there is not equal justice for crime victims. And there's still people that are going without justice or safety. And so that, I think, is something, that still has to be addressed. People are still going missing. They're being murdered. We're not talking about it. We're not seeing this issue on Dateline or the local news. It's just something that needs more attention, it needs more resources, and it needs more help.
Well, thank you for talking with us today and giving the listener and the audience an understanding of this very complicated and complex issue of how tribal governments and tribal courts interact with state and local governments and the federal government, and also just learning a lot more about you and how you have become the civic leader that we're so proud to have as part of the Flinn-Brown Network. And I really thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you for all you do, and thank you for the conversations and the programs that you run for the state of Arizona. I do think it's making an impact. I do see my fellow fellows working across the state and doing great work, from Yuma to Flagstaff to Sierra Vista. It's great to see everything that's happening and to know that my colleagues are out there pushing Arizona forward.
And we're lucky to have you, Fred. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
That wraps up this episode of Leadership Forward. You can find out more about the work of the Arizona Center for Civic Leadership at our website, azcivicleadership.org.